Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our deck number 143 and it's titled a Ridonculus Homunculus. I'm going to give a shout out to my friend Grace for coming up with an amazing title. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So first up, obviously, we got to talk about our random card, and this week it is entirely random. Typically, we may have cards suggested to us by our patrons or by people who are viewing the channel. So if you would like to have a suggested card put in, you can, of course, send them to us by any of our social media accounts. You can also put them in the comments, but this one is entirely random. So this one is Humongulus, and Humongulus is 4 and a blue for a 2/5 homunculus, and it has hexproof. And, well, that's it. There's not too much to go on with this card, if I'm being perfectly honest. I wasn't quite sure what to do when I first got this as the random card. You may be able to guess what we're doing by the title, but just in case you don't, let's show off our commander and see if that kind of raises some more suspicion for you. So our commander this week adds a couple of colors to our deck's color identity, because we are playing Teamer. So we have Borborygmos and Fblthp in the command zone, which is 2 green, blue, red for a 6/5 legendary creature Cyclops Homunculus. Whenever Borborygmos and Fblthp enters the battlefield or attacks, draw a card, then you may discard any number of land cards. When you discard one or more cards this way, Borborygmos and Fblthp deals twice that much damage to target creature. Then you can also pay 1 and a blue to put Borborygmos and Fblthp into its owner's library third from the top. Oh, that is a lot of words on one card, but essentially, we're kind of just playing this for the creature type. And yeah, it's got some good abilities, and we are going to make good use of those abilities, don't get me wrong, but you may have noticed the card of the week was a homunculus, and Borborygmos and Fblthp is a legendary homunculus. So with that in mind, that leads us obviously into the first theme of our deck, which is homunculus. This is a homunculus kindred deck. We want to be playing as many homunculus as possible, and I'm going to be perfectly honest with you up front. There are a lot of really bad homunculus cards in the game of Magic the Gathering, and we are pretty much playing all of them. There's not a ton of synergies that are tying homunculus together as a creature type, and there's also not that many powerful homunculus. They tend to float between 2 to 4 mana. They're not very strong. They don't have a lot of toughness. So we had to try to find some unique ways to make them work. And so a good example of what we may be trying to do is Stitcher's Apprentice, which is 1 and a blue for a 1/2 homunculus. You can pay 1 and a blue, tap it to make a 2/2 blue homunculus creature token, then sacrifice a creature. Most of the time, this isn't going to be super great because it is going to force us to sacrifice a creature, but we do have some creatures that actually want to go to the graveyard, as strange as that is, so it will help us in that regard, but it also makes more homunculus, and what more could you want out of a homunculus deck than a homunculus that makes more homunculus? Also, I'm going to get this out of the way real quick. I don't know what the plural for homunculus is. I don't know if it's homunculuses or homunculi or whatever. If you do know, let me know, because I probably already messed it up at some point in this video, and I would love to know the actual answer to that question. But before I get too off topic, let's move into our second theme for the deck, which is going to be landfall. Because our commander wants us to be discarding a ton of lands, we had to kind of find ways to go out of our way to play more lands and do more with them. And a great payoff for that is going to be Tatyova Benthic Druid, which is 3 green and blue for a 3/3 legendary creature merfolk druid. She has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Since we're playing so many lands, and there's a good chance we're going to have a ton of lands in our hand, so that way we can trigger our commander, we might as well also benefit from playing those lands in our hand, and what better way to benefit than gaining life and drawing cards. Now, We do have other ways to benefit from the lands, either being in our hand, in our graveyard, in our deck, whatever, but I feel like Tatyova is a great representation of what we're kind of trying to do. And so, finally, we get to our last theme of the deck, which is going to be just kind of generic Kindred decks, because there's not a ton of ways that we can really care about Homunculus, because if we're being perfectly honest, there's not a ton of Homunculus support in Magic the Gathering. There's nothing that says all Homunculus get +1/+1, or whenever a Homunculus does something, you do something. So we have to find the generic cards that care about any creature type, especially the ones that let us choose the creature type. So, for example, we have For the Ancestors, which is 2 and a green for an instant. Choose a creature type. It's going to be Homunculus, obviously. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal any number of cards of the chosen type from among them and put the revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Then it has Flashback for 3 and a green. This could be, if we get really, really lucky, just a 3 mana instant speed draw 6. Now, that's going to be very unlikely, so don't bank on that, but there's still a very good chance this is an instant speed, pay 3 mana, draw 2, 3, maybe 4 cards, because we do have quite a few Homunculus in the deck. Although we do have some other creatures like Tatyova, for example, that don't fit the bill, we still have a large portion of Homunculus and Changeling creatures that will still count for the Ancestors. So those are our major themes for this week. And of course, the next thing we're going to have to do is talk about some of the key cards in this deck. These are the cards that synergize incredibly well with what we're trying to do and are some of our main win conditions and value pieces. So the first of the key cards that I'd like to talk about is going to be Shared Animosity. As I've already mentioned, we don't have a ton of power on our creatures. There's a lot of Homunculus that are 1 power, 2 power, maybe 3 power if we're lucky, but they're almost always going to be just 1 or 2 power. Shared Animosity turns them into a lethal board state just by existing, because Shared Animosity is 2 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+0 until the end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a creature type with it. So, for example, and the way that this math would work out, is if we had 2 1/1 Homunculus, they both attack, they both see another attacking Homunculus, so they get an additional +1/+0, and they attack as a 2 power creature each. And that doesn't seem like a lot, particularly when we're talking about just a small number of them, but keep in mind, Homunculus tend to be pretty mana efficient, so there's a good chance we could have 5, 6, maybe more Homunculus in play, and if they're all getting +5 every single time they attack, they can really start knocking people out of the game very, very quickly. And it's especially relevant that a lot of Homunculus have kind of sneaky abilities. They tend to kind of go under the radar. They tend to not be a threat to the table. So if we have a huge board state, our opponents might not really be looking at us, and then we can slam Shared Animosity and just start taking people out. So it really flies under the radar, and it can be an incredibly efficient game ender. But that is just one of the key cards that we're going to be talking about. The second one is going to look a little bit different to Shared Animosity. It's going to be Ridonculus. So not only do we want to be attacking our opponents, we want to try to have ways to prevent our opponents from attacking us. And while it might not be ideal, because it's not making our opponents pay, it's not making them lose life or anything, Ridonculus is still going to be a great way to prevent people from attacking us, because it is 2 and a blue for a 1/4 Homunculus. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, that creature's controller mills 2. And again, that's not a huge deal, but a lot of times it's enough to prevent our opponents from attacking us because we don't look threatening. We're not really going to be presenting a problem on our board, and if they attack us instead of someone else, they'd be losing cards, and a lot of people just don't want to do that. So this is a great example, these 2 cards in particular, that show what we're really trying to do. We really want to not be a problem at the table until all of a sudden we just kind of are. So we're flying under the radar until the moment we know we're able to strike. Then we send all of the homunculus in to dish out some damage. And, of course, with that in mind, we get to our final key card, which is going to be Champion of Lambholt. So Champion of Lambholt is 1 green for a 1/1 human warrior. Creatures with power less than Champion of Lambholt's power can't block creatures you control, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lambholt. Most of the time, Champion's going to get very big very quickly because, again, as I've mentioned, homunculus tend to be pretty inexpensive. They tend to be 2, 3, maybe 4 mana. So we can very quickly grow the champion, and then our opponents are not able to block any of our creatures, which becomes especially relevant when we have something like Shared Animosity. And if we can swing in for, say, 20 damage and our opponents can't block it, then that game's only going to go a couple more turns unless our opponents can find an answer, which it feels kind of bad when your opponents have to start board wiping the homunculus. So that's when you really know you've put the fear of the homunculus into your opponents. But those are all of our cool key cards. So the next thing we're going to have to do is jump into some cool interactions. And this is where we're going to highlight some of the cards that synergize very well together and kind of just build unique and interesting board states. So the first of these cool interactions that I would like to talk about is going to be between Instruments of War and Kenku Artificer. And yes, I know neither of them are homunculus, but trust me, it'll make sense in a second. So Instruments of War is 4 mana for an artifact. It has flash. As Instruments of War enters the battlefield, choose a creature type, and creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. I'll be perfectly honest, I had no idea this card even existed until I started building this deck, and I'm already a big fan, so I think it's a super cool card. And that's just on its own. When we combine it with Kenku Artificer, which is 2 and a blue for a 1/1 bird artificer that has Homunculus Servant, when Kenku Artificer enters the battlefield, put 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature artifact. That artifact becomes a 0/0 homunculus artifact creature with flying. Now, you might already see where this is going, but if we have Instruments of War in play and we cast Kenku Artificer, we can put the 3 counters on Instruments of War. That turns it into a homunculus. It also has flying, which honestly is one of the best keyword abilities that a homunculus could have. And then the Instruments of War gives all homunculus +1/+1. Since it is now a homunculus, it becomes a 4/4 flying creature, which, as bad as this may sound, is the biggest thing we've got in our entire deck for the most part. There's a couple of exceptions, but again, homunculus are very tiny creatures. So that puts a big threat on the board. And combined with some of the other cards that we've talked about, like Shared Animosity, that 4/4 flyer can become a huge threat very, very quickly. So I'm a big fan of both of these cards. I've never actually gotten to play either of them. Like I mentioned, I didn't really know Instruments of War existed before this, but I am very excited to see what they can do in this deck, and I'm probably going to be putting both of these in other decks in the future as well. But that is only cool interaction number 1. We still have to talk about, of course, cool interaction number 2, which is between Reflections of Litjara and Jeering Homunculus. So Reflections of Litjara is 4 and a blue for an enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Whenever you cast a spell of the chosen type, copy that spell. The card that we're going to pair it with is Jeering Homunculus, which, if we're being perfectly honest, this could be any enter the battlefield effect that's on a homunculus, but I like this one in particular because it is 1 and a blue for a 0/4 homunculus. When it enters the battlefield, you may goad target creature. There's not a ton of removal when you're looking at homunculus decks, so being able to goad 2 of the biggest things in play and put 2 0/4s into play is incredibly relevant in a deck that really wants to protect itself and do damage to its opponents. So being able to do that much damage to an opponent is incredibly relevant. Then we have a couple of big bodies to be able to defend, and maybe with a little bit of boosts from things like Shared Animosity, they can eventually become offensive as well. So like I said, any ETB effect could replace Jeering Homunculus, but I think the goad is incredibly relevant. So that is the vast majority of our deck tech. The last thing we're really going to have to do is talk about the price of the deck. And this week, just like last week actually, we have a very cheap deck. This week we are coming in at $43.79, which is below half of our total budget limit of $100, and our most expensive card actually takes up a decent portion of that price because it is Titan of Littjara at a massive $8.22. So if you're looking to trim the price of the deck down to only $35, you can very easily cut out the Titan of Littjara and replace it with something else. However, let's read through Titan of Littjara and you'll probably realize why you may not want to cut it. It is 4 blue for a 6/6 illusion. I know, not a homunculus, but just wait. As Titan of Littjara enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. There it is. And Titan of Littjara is the chosen type in addition to its other types. Then, whenever Titan of Littjara enters the battlefield or attacks, you may draw a card for each other creature you control that shares a creature type with it. If you do, discard a card. So if we have, say, 5 homunculus in play, we play the Titan of Littjara, it immediately draws us 5 cards, then we discard a card. Then, next turn, it attacks, we draw 5 more, we discard a card. This is one of the most efficient card draw engines in the entire deck, because like I've said, we tend to build up a pretty big board of homunculus and then can't really do too much with them until we get some form of pump effect in play, and Titan of Littjara is going to help us dig for that pump effect. This gets us to everything that gives +1/+1, all of our anthems, that gets us to shared animosity, things like that. So Titan of Littjara is immensely powerful, but it is, like I mentioned, unfortunately, $8. So if you do need to cut it, you can certainly replace it with some other form of card draw that's probably a little bit cheaper, but if you can keep it in, I would highly recommend it. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card that's a little bit outside of the budget, and in this case it's not technically outside of the budget, it's just a little bit more expensive than I wanted to spend, and a card that I would replace it with, I've got you covered. So this week I would recommend putting in Life from the Loam and taking out Changeling Titan. So first up, Life from the Loam is 1 and a green for a sorcery. Return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand, and it has Dredge for 3. Taking it out would be Changeling Titan, which is 4 and a green for a 7/7 shapeshifter with Changeling and champion a creature. Now, let's talk about the Titan before we talk about Life from the Loam. But Changeling Titan, while pretty decent and by far the biggest homunculus in the entire deck, is just a 7/7 that also technically exiles one of our own creatures. And yeah, we could get it back into play when the Titan dies, but having no evasion, having no real way to give it evasion, doesn't make it as powerful as you might think. And I definitely fell into the trap of putting it in here and then playing a couple games with the deck and realizing that it most of the time either just sits there as a defender or attacks and gets blocked by a 1/1 or a 2/2, and it doesn't feel quite as good as you want it to. So that is a bit of a downside for Changeling Titan, and why I would recommend taking it out if you're putting in Life from the Loam, which also looks a little bit weird in the deck because we're not necessarily a lands style deck. But because our commander wants us to be discarding so many cards and it cares about us having cards in our hand, we might as well be able to return those lands from our graveyard to our hand every single turn, especially because we can just dredge Life from the Loam. Then we have more lands to discard, more damage that could be dealt by our commander, and we can kind of just clear away any blockers that might exist, letting us slowly chip away and win the game. So Life from the Loam winds up being a much more powerful value engine than you might expect, considering we're not technically a graveyard deck, but it does power our commander. So that is the only out-of-budget upgrade that I would recommend for this deck. And before we get into the game, because we do have to play this deck in a game and see how it actually performs, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So if you're interested, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit, u/POYNZ13, or send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All of those are great ways to reach out. If you ever have any questions, if you ever want to suggest cards for the channel, please do check us out there. You can always suggest cards in the comments of the YouTube videos. I love reading the comments, so do that if you're interested. And then, of course, you can always just like the videos and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. However, if you're looking to go a little bit above and beyond the normal helping out of the channel, you can also find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. If you join either of those places, you'll get access to things like the deck lists a week early. You'll get access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games. So if you want to be in the games on the channel, that is a great way to do it. You'll get the guarantee from me that any cards you suggest for the channel will be turned into decks eventually. It might take me a while because I do get kind of backed up sometimes, but I will get to them, I promise. And then you also get the unedited gameplay videos, so you can see the players kind of having a good time and chatting with each other, seeing all of our misplays and everything as they're happening in real time. And you'll also get a random card sent to you every single month as a thank you. It will be one of the 4 random cards that we built around that month. So hopefully, if that's something you're interested in, then check us out on Patreon or as a channel member. And there you'll get to join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. So to the 11 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And with all of that being said, let's get into our game. So, as we've talked about, we gotta play our homunculus against some opponents, and our opponents this week actually all decided to also bring out their kindred decks to see how they fared against the homunculus, because as we know, homunculus are the superior creature type, so we've got to play it against some less supported creature types in Magic, such as zombies, spirits, and demons. So this week, we are going to be playing against Shawn, who is playing Verena, Lich Queen, Jason playing Millicent, Restless Revenant, and Bilal playing Be'lakor, the Dark Master. I don't really have too much to say about each of these decks other than the very obvious that Verena is a zombie deck, Millicent is a spirit deck, and Be'lakor is a demon deck. So obviously the lesser creature types are going to have to contend with the power that is homunculus. I do think if I had to pick one of these opponents to be the biggest threat at the table, I would probably pick Verena just because I know the power of Verena. And being able to make a ton of zombie tokens every single turn, which then get turned into card draw and life gain, is probably going to make it very difficult for us to do too much. But I wouldn't discount any of the other opponents as well. I know Millicent can be incredibly powerful, can go very wide very quickly, and then Be'lakor just kind of spits out a ton of damage by just playing demons and then just smashing face, and has flying attackers, which is less than ideal because homunculus tend not to fly very often. But I think the game is going to be sweet. I'm very excited to have a full Kindred game. And if you are interested as well, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel. And I think without any further ado, let's jump into this game. We'll see how we do, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Shawn, Jason, and then Bilal. On my first turn, I play a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. Shawn plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size. Jason plays an Unclaimed Territory, naming Spirits. Bilal plays an Island. I play a Path of Ancestry. Shawn plays an Unclaimed Territory, naming Zombies, and casts Azorius Signet. Jason plays a Plains and casts Dorothea, Vengeful Victim, which sacrifices itself at the end of turn if it attacks or blocks. Bilal plays a Mountain and casts Prismatic Lens. I play a Rockfall Veil and cast Kodama's Reach, searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into my hand. Shawn casts Arcane Signet, then casts Shepherd Rot, which can tap to make each player lose life equal to the number of zombies on the battlefield. Then he plays a Dimir Aqueduct, returning Reliquary Tower to his hand. Jason plays an Island and casts Kami of the Crescent Moon, letting each player draw an additional card in their upkeep. In Bilal's upkeep, he draws an additional card, then plays an island and casts Herald of Slanesh, making his demons cost 2 less to cast and also giving them haste. In my upkeep, I draw an additional card, then I cast Oculus, letting me draw a card when it dies, and also cast Frilled Oculus, allowing me to pay 2 mana to give it +2/+2 until the end of turn, but only once each turn. I then play a Myriad Landscape and pass. In Shawn's upkeep, he draws an additional card, then replays Reliquary Tower, once again gaining no maximum hand size, and casts his commander Varina Lich Queen, so whenever he attacks, he gets to draw cards, discard cards, and gain life equal to the number of zombies that are attacking. She also lets him pay 2 mana to exile 2 cards from his graveyard to make a 2/2 zombie token. Finally, he activates Shepherd of Rot, making each player lose 2 life since he controls 2 zombies. When Jason draws for his turn, he draws an additional card, then plays a Path of Ancestry, and casts Denic Pious Apprentice, preventing cards in graveyards from being the target of spells or abilities. Bilal draws an additional card on his turn, plays a mountain, and casts his commander Belakor the Dark Master, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life when it enters since he controls 2 demons, and also letting any other demon that enters under his control do damage equal to its power to any target. On my turn, I draw an additional card, play a forest, cast a Soul Ring, and then cast Jeering Homunculus, goading Belakor when it enters the battlefield. Shawn draws an additional card, plays a swamp, and then moves to combat, attacking me for 4 with Varina, and Jason for 1 with the Shepherd, triggering Varina so that on attacks, Shawn draws 2 cards, discards 2 cards, and gains 2 life. I block with my Frilled Oculus, activating its ability to make it a 3/5, taking no damage, while Jason blocks with Denic, killing the Shepherd, actually gaining 2 life thanks to lifelink. Then in Shawn's second main phase, he casts Diregraph Captain, giving his other zombies +1/+1 and making target opponent lose a life whenever one of his zombies dies. In response, I sacrifice my Myriad Landscape, searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Shawn then plays a Drowned Catacombs, which unfortunately he couldn't have done since he'd already played a land this turn. Jason draws an additional card for his turn, and casts Bygone Bishop, letting him investigate whenever he casts a creature with mana value 3 or less. Bilal draws an additional card, and moves straight to combat, attacking Shawn for 6 with Belakor. Then, in his second main phase, he plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. On my turn, I draw an additional card, play a command tower, then cast Changeling Titan, championing the Jeering Homunculus so it's exiled until the Titan leaves play. I then cast my commander, Borborygmos and Fblthp, but unfortunately Shawn has an answer, countering it with Counterspell. Then, at the end of turn, Shawn cycles Lonely Island and Secluded Steppe. In Shawn's upkeep, he draws an additional card, then casts Cryptbreaker, letting him tap it and discard a card to make a 2/2 zombie token, or tap 3 zombies to lose a life and draw a card. He also casts the Scarab God, which lets him pay 4 mana to exile a creature from a graveyard and create a 4/4 zombie token that's a copy of it, and also lets him scry X while each opponent loses X in his upkeep, where X is the number of zombies he controls. In Jason's upkeep, he draws an additional card, plays a Plains, and casts his commander Millicent Restless Revenant, letting him make a 1/1 spirit token whenever any of his non-token spirits die or deal combat damage to a player. In response, Bilal casts Stinging Study, drawing 6 cards and losing 6 life since his commander has a mana value of 6. Once that resolves, Jason attacks Shawn for 4 with Dorothea, sacrificing her after combat and making 2 spirit tokens, one for doing damage and another for Dorothea dying. In Bilal's upkeep, he draws an additional card, plays a Blightstep Pathway, casts an Arcane Signet, and also casts Herald of Anguish, making each opponent discard a card in Bilal's end step. Then, when he moves to his end step, Shawn taps 3 zombies to draw a card and lose a life, then each of Bilal's opponents discard a card. In my upkeep, I draw an additional card and play an Exotic Orchard, then I cast Referee Squad, tapping Be'lakor and putting a stun counter on it when it enters. I move to combat, attacking Shawn for 7 with the Titan. Then, in my second main phase, I cast Amoeboid Changeling, which can tap to make target creature lose or gain all creature types until the end of turn. At the end of turn, Shawn activates Varina, exiling 2 cards from his graveyard to make a zombie token. Then in his upkeep, he scries 4 with the Scarab God, makes each opponent lose 4 life, and draws an additional card. He then casts Rooftop Storm, letting him cast zombie spells without paying their mana costs. This lets him cast Lord of the Undead, giving his other zombies +1/+1, Bone Miser, letting him make a zombie token if he discards a creature, 2 black mana if he discards a land, and draw a card if he discards a non-creature non-land. He also casts Headless Rider, making a zombie token when a non-token zombie dies, and finally cast Plague Belcher, putting 2 -1/-1 counters on Bone Miser, making each opponent lose a life whenever a zombie he controls dies. He then moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 17 with his zombies, drawing a total of 4 cards, discarding 4 cards, and gaining 4 life. Then, since he discarded cards, he triggers Bone Miser, making 4 black mana and drawing 2 cards. Then Bilal blocks Varina with the Herald of Anguish and Diagraph Captain with the Herald of Slaanesh, killing both of Bilal's creatures while he only takes 8. In Shawn's second main phase, he plays a Plains and activates Varina twice, exiling 4 cards from his graveyard, making 2 more zombies. Jason draws an extra card in his upkeep and casts Darksteel Mutation, enchanting the Scarab God, turning it into an indestructible 0/1 insect with no abilities. He then disturbs Dorothea's Retribution, enchanting Millicent, letting him make an attacking 4/4 spirit token whenever Millicent attacks. He then attacks Shawn for 8 with his Flying Spirits, making another attacking 4/4 token for a total of 12, then also making 2 additional spirit tokens when his 2 non-token spirits do combat damage. Finally, he sacrifices the 4/4 spirit at the end of combat. Bilal plays a Reflecting Pool and casts Patriarch's Bidding, letting each player name a creature type, then all players return all creatures of the named type from their graveyards to play. To nobody's surprise, the types named are Demon, Homunculus, Zombie, and Spirit. In response though, I cast Fact or Fiction, revealing the top 5 cards of my library, letting Bilal split them into 2 piles, putting one into my hand and the other to my graveyard. This results in me putting Izzet Signet and Arcane Signet to my hand, and a Mountain, Rampant Growth, and Bonded Fetch into my graveyard. Then the Patriarch's Bidding resolves. Shawn, Jason, and I don't trigger any abilities on our board, but Bilal does. Each of his demons that enters triggers Be'lakor's ability, doing damage equal to their power to any target. This lets him deal 15 damage to Shawn, knocking him out of the game, 9 damage to me, and 11 damage to Jason. He also has the Sower of Discord enter, meaning that for as long as it's in play, if Jason or I take damage, then the other player takes that much damage too. Finally, since the Herald of Slaanesh gives his entire team haste, he's able to attack me for 35 damage, doing that damage to both opponents, knocking us both out, and winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely kind of what I expected. Unfortunately, we kind of just got beat down by zombies and spirits and demons. But the ending of the game kind of came out of nowhere as a bit of a surprise. So we'll start with our deck. We'll kind of work our way around the table, talk about how everybody did. I think overall our deck did very well. We did flood out a little bit. We drew a lot of lands, and we couldn't quite stop drawing lands even when we got to the point where we could kind of filter what we were doing, but not enough to really stop what our opponents were doing, unfortunately. We never found any of our pump effects or anthem effects, so we just kind of sat around with a bunch of tiny homunculus, which was not the best showing from our deck, but it definitely proves that we can make a board presence, and we taught Shawn to fear the homunculus because we punched him for 7 with the giant titan, so, you know, little wins here and there. Next up, though, Shawn definitely looked like the threat for most of the game, especially once he dropped that rooftop storm. I think that if he'd been able to untap for another turn, there was no way that we were going to be able to win, because he was just going to refill his entire hand with a ton of cards with Varina and then just kind of go off. So it was very, I don't want to say lucky that we all lost the turn before, but I think that if he'd had one more turn, he definitely would have won that game. Next up with Jason, he also kind of ran into the problem where he couldn't find any good anthem effects for his spirits, or he couldn't find a way to make sure that he had a ton of spirits. He was starting to get there with Millicent, but he also needed probably a couple more turns to be able to do too much with it. I think that if Millicent had come down sooner and he'd had more non-token spirits, he could have built a massive army, but unfortunately wasn't quite in the cards today. And then last but not least, the winner of the game, Bilal, played a ton of demons, but honestly what really helped him was being able to draw a bunch of cards and then actually discard them to hand size, because when he got to that Patriarch's bidding, even he wasn't aware that he was essentially winning the game right then and there, because he thought he was just getting back a ton of demons, and he didn't even catch on to the fact that Be'lakor did damage enough to knock a couple people out of the game until about midway through resolving his enter the battlefield triggers. So it was kind of cool to see this almost accidental win come from just a synergy of the deck, so that was very cool. And then of course the Herald of Slaanesh being the MVP, giving his team haste so he could take Jason and I out in one single turn. Very, very impressive. Be'lakor always impresses every time I see it. It's just a terrifying commander to sit down across the table from. But overall, I hope you enjoyed the game, and I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. If there's any cards you think that I should include that I might have missed, or any cards that you think aren't quite worth it in the deck, please let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear what you think of the deck. This was a bit of a silly one, but I was very proud of it. So let me know what you think. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.